All right, let's bring her on. She is a comedian. She is one of the main subjects of the Netflix Untold series that dropped on Tuesday called The Fall of Favre. She's a good friend of mine. She's coming on this podcast again for the first time in a while. It is Jenn Sterger. Jenn, thanks for
How's
coming
it
on.
going?
How are you?
I'm good. I mean, listen, this isn't my favorite subject to discuss, but I honestly, I hope that the documentary is kind of like the period on the end of the sentence where it's like,
Yeah.
this is the biggest platform I've ever had the privilege of sharing my story on. And I think we're at a place where people are finally ready to potentially listen and be a little more open-minded about it.
Yeah. Before we get into it, you knew that you and I both have a love for Back to the Future, so you knew I was going to wear something Back to the Future related on this podcast.
I
I was
did.
like,
I
I was
did.
like, am I going to go with the I attended the Enchantment Under the Sea dance shirt? I was like, no, I wore that like 2 weeks ago. I had my 1.21 gigawatt shirt. I wore that a couple weeks. I wore that like a
You're like,
month
that
ago.
one's in the laundry. Oh,
Yeah, this
man.
one I was like, oh, I haven't worn this one. I think actually this is the first time I've worn this one on the podcast, so we're
It's
good to
great.
go. Yeah, I
It's
am
great. I
in
love it.
density. All right, so a lot of people probably saw the doc, but for those that didn't, we know that you were a major player. I'd say what 30 to 35% of this documentary is you is what I would put
I
the percentage at.
I have no idea, honestly. It's funny, the first time I watched the doc, I actually dissociated
Oh, really?
because it's just I think it's so easy to go back. Anyone that's ever experienced trauma knows this feeling, and it's so easy to go back to the scene of the crime in your body and like somatically when you see it again in front of you. And for a long time when the story was actually, playing itself out in the court of public opinion and through the NFL investigation in 2010, I was one of the biggest sports stories in news. So it was
Oh
hard
yeah,
for me to even watch sports because my name was on the bottom ticker. You know what I mean? Like I could not avoid this in any aspect of my life. So watching it back in a television, format, it definitely brought back those feels. It was also so interesting to see old footage of me because
yeah,
one, I'm so adorably cringe. Um, like anyone that and I think that that's part of the problem is if people knew who I was as a person and not just as a photograph, they'd be like, "This chick's a little dork." Like, what? You know what I mean? Like, she's just a dork that learned how to put on makeup and play the game, you
yeah.
know?
Well,
And I think so much of that comes through in the documentary and in watching the old footage of myself.
what's funny is, I mean, you and I have talked for a long time. I think we've been friends for close to 10 years now. And we've
God,
talked
it's
about a
been
lot of
that
things. We're
long?
going, I think so. I want to say 2015, 2016, I think is when I first reached out to you.
Mhm.
But watching the documentary and then obviously knowing you off camera, bringing us back to the Florida State days, I didn't know the story about your outfit for the game, of how you just kind of threw it together. You weren't planning on going to the game. That I didn't know that was
No.
a thing.
No, the first time, I definitely wasn't planning on going to the game like that. I was bartending. I bartended my way through college. I had a full ride at Florida State, like, full scholarship for academics, but I still had to pay for, like, my housing and my books and things like that, and any incidentals, so I bartended my way through college, and really, that was the only socializing I had. I didn't participate in Greek life. The idea of letting that many women tell me what to do with my life just did not sit with me. I'm so adverse to any kind of conformity or being told what to do. That it's that what do they call it? Pathological demand avoidance.
Mm.
I'm so big on that I didn't need it. So I did most of my socializing bartending, and that particular day I bartended before the game, and then I went over to the tailgate. And when I went over to the tailgate, this guy spilled beer all down the front of my shirt. And it's like 95 degrees, and at these games, the beginning games of the season in
With 100%
Tallahassee.
humidity too.
Oh, it's disgusting. You could cut it with a knife.
Yeah.
So I just was like, forget this. Like there's kids there with their shirts off, there's such a double standard for women because there's guys there that have like, letters painted on their chest. They're completely covered in glitter. And somehow I was the one that was underdressed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, look, compared to what we see now, it's that, I guess in what year was that? 05,
05.
06,
Yeah.
05.
05.
I guess in 05, we were at the early stages of, Maxim and FHM being big deals
That
and
was
Sling
actually,
happening.
yeah, that was actually kind of their peak.
Yeah.
That was when everything, and it's so funny because I remember my college sweetheart had like pictures of Vita Guerrera and all of these, like, you remember, like, right? Like those
Oh, yeah.
girls that you're like, what happened to them?
Yeah.
But those girls of the time that just became famous for being absolutely gorgeous. And like, but there was a certain aesthetic, that they desired in like the early 2000s. And I just remember looking at those girls and being like, I'll never be one of those girls, but man, it would be cool. Like, if I ever became one of those girls, I will have successfully fooled everyone.
And it just from a 5-8 second clip coming back from commercial, Brett Busliger makes a comment, and then you are everywhere. You're like the it girl for college co-eds. And
I was like a viral sensation before viral was a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, this is the beginning stages of the internet. Facebook was just starting.
Yeah.
And you had to have a college edu extension on your email just to even register. Your parents couldn't get on it yet, so it was way better. And it was just a different time back then. But the way that I really got popular was message boards.
Yeah.
And message boards and blog sites really pushed around my pictures. And that's kind of what got the whole, infamy started in terms of being famous on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, you did, Maxim, you do Playboy. I never asked
I did them in the reverse order, which
Reverse,
is
yeah,
not
that's right. You did
common.
Playboy
It's not
first.
common.
Yeah.
They actually, Maxim called me the week after I shot Playboy. And they were like, we'd love to have you in the magazine. They're like, but just curious, did you shoot Playboy? And I said, I actually just shot it last week. And they were like, oh, bummer. Because like, they're like, once you've seen that, why would they want to see this? Which is a fair point,
It is, but I think people wouldn't complain either way. They'd be like, whatever.
But so he called me back a little later and he goes, when does your Playboy spread come out? And I was like, I think it comes out in May. And he goes, cool, we're going to put you in March. He goes, I'll see you next week in New York. And that was my first trip to New York City.
Okay. One thing I didn't ask you was, obviously it was going crazy back then. You said message boards blowing up and, the Maxim attention, the Playboy attention. What was the craziest it ever got for you where you got to a point where you're like, oh my gosh, this is way bigger than I ever expected? Was there a moment? Was there someone who reached out to you? Was it just anything like, holy crap, I am going quote unquote viral?
Steve.
Uh-oh.
Truly. I think when it really hit me is when I went to I made it in the Maxim Hot 100 that year.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be like the list of the most 100 beautiful women as curated by Maxim and People's Publicist. But the fact that I made it on that list with no publicist, was a big deal to young me.
Because you were not somebody that went around modeling. You literally caught at a game for 8 seconds. Yeah.
Exactly. I wasn't a model. A model. In fact, like I had tried to model earlier I had tried to audition for Sports Illustrated and they were just like, no, I had tried to audition for Abercrombie and Fitch and they told me I didn't look enough like the all-American girl. So I had been turned down right and left in terms of not being pretty enough is what I was told, And look, even during my Maxim shoot, there were 2 other girls there that I got discovered with. And one of the stylists during my Maxim shoot said, with an earshot of me, like, oh, I have to dress the fat one. And I was the fat one. And I was just like, wow. And that just like, when I look back at moments like that, it just shows you how cruel we were to women in the early 2000s in terms of like body standards and just unrealistic expectations of beauty,
And you don't need to give your measurement.
But I didn't tell you the part yet, by the way. I didn't tell you. I messed up. I buried the lead. So Steve, when I went to the Hot 100 party.
Yeah.
I I got hit on by someone that I had grown up watching on TV and movies. And I ended up later going on dates with that person. And I'm like, this is like a guy that would have been like in your Tiger Beat magazines growing up. Do you know what I mean? And I mean, 25, like 23-year-old me was really excited, but like 13-year-old me was like, we have fucking made it. Like,
And you can't give us who that was.
um, uh, I'll just say the words. I'll just say the words Dawson's Creek.
Oh, nice. That's great.
One
Although
of them.
I was going to say I don't know which one. I'm trying to think of which one.
One of them. Dawson's Creek.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's great.
that was right.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
especially like that for me. My equivalent back then would have been because I literally, when I walked home from school in 5th grade, would go to the grocery store, look at Teen Beat, Pop, Bop, Tiger Beat, all those, and I would buy them if I had the money and cut out pictures of Alyssa Milano. Like that was my girl. And I would literally have pictures all over of her from Bop and Teen Beat.
Exactly. It was very much that vibe. You know what I mean? So yeah, I got to go on a few dates with him. He's lovely, but like ended up actually going with a movie star, like a legitimate movie star, which I was like, I get, you know, it was one of those things where I'm like, I'm just happy to be here, you know? That was one of those things. And it's just so funny because like same with you, you know, like for instance, Devin Sawa follows me on Instagram. And like again, if you're a woman my age, like Devin Sawa was peak coming of age story for us. You know what I mean? It might be the first penis we've seen. You know what I mean? Like or you're like, were you like curious because you're like, I saw a boy's butt in a movie. What's this about? You know? But he follows me on Instagram. And I just remember when I saw that, like again, 13-year-old me was like, nice.
It's just there's so much to the story. People that see the doc, we don't need to relive everything. A lot of it is very intricate. They do go into details about what happened. So if you saw the documentary, you know. If not, go watch the documentary. But there's some main points to take out of it because we're just living in different times. And I think one of the things that you've said over the years, you've said it to me, you've said it publicly, I believe you said it on my podcast back in the day, was you were the Me Too movement before the Me Too movement. And I think that's such a big thing that you can take from this whole ordeal is that for me at the time, because you're working for the Jets in 08, this all went down in 08. And I think a lot of people, maybe after seeing the doc, maybe they didn't understand the timeline or whatever, but I think people understand that maybe people thought this story broke while you were still working for the Jets. And it's not the case. Like you did not tell other than, you know, confided in friends and your girlfriends. Oh my God, I can't believe this happened.
I confided in friends.
Yeah. Did you tell your family?
No.
No.
How do you broach that conversation? You know what I mean? Like at Thanksgiving, like, hey, a guy sent me pictures of his dick. Pass this turkey, you know, like it doesn't honestly, it was just so humiliating. And I felt like I had done something wrong. And because there's this thing that I think I learned a lot about when I was in college. It was actually my last class I took when I was in college was a class called victimology. And I had a criminology psychology double major. And I remember one of the takeaways from this class was if you had experienced any kind of childhood trauma or especially, you know, in a sexual nature, you were more likely to continue to be a victim of those type of things the rest of your life unless you did something about it. You know what I mean? It's just like victims stay victims until they figure out how to develop better coping strategies. Because like when you come on and you come onto this earth, like you aren't taught how to handle these type of experiences. And I definitely wasn't taught how to, handle something of this magnitude. So I did the thing that I thought was the thing to do, which was tell people. tell people and ask people for advice that I thought would give me good advice. And the only advice I ever got was, if you like your job, stay quiet.
Yeah.
That was the only advice I was ever given. Is it's like, Jen, like, and just the way they phrased it made me feel like, oh, I brought this upon myself. And so that was something I really internalized from the whole situation is I must have done something to deserve it. You know, that's always a narrative that I've had playing in my head since I was younger is I'm bad, so bad things happen to me. And it's something I've worked a lot on in therapy and obviously had to work a lot on while revisiting the doc itself. But um, when you internalize things that way, you don't want to tell people that. Like, shame's a very powerful emotion. You know what I mean? So I kept it to myself for the most part. My therapist knew, um, people at the Jets knew, and my assistant knew, obviously, which they talk about in the doc. And I'm shocked they got him involved in the documentary because he's a civilian now, and he had nothing to gain by coming out and telling what actually happened to me. But I think it says a lot that the person that came to my defense, the biggest in the documentary, was a man that saw everything unfolding. And he said, I mean, his story matched mine exactly.
What happened was 2 years later is when this story broke. Like you said,
Yeah.
you'd only told people privately. This wasn't something where you were immediately like, oh my God, I'm going to run to the tabloids and I'm going to get famous off this. Because right now, if this happened in 2025, I think a lot of people would run to TikTok because people go to TikTok about, oh my God, this date that I went on with so and so. It's like the next morning they're putting stuff
Yeah.
out there. You did nothing. You obviously did nothing to deserve it, other than you confided in somebody that obviously betrayed you. And his name was AJ DeLorio, who at the time was a writer for Deadspin. You told him in private you had befriended him,
I was working
and
for him.
working for him.
Yeah,
You guys were friends.
I was a source. Friends is a loose term. I was a
Okay.
source,
Okay.
Deadspin didn't really, it wasn't necessarily journalism, but Deadspin published a lot of blind items and published a lot of tabloid type stuff in terms of sports.
Sports. Yeah.
And they were always looking for sources, and a lot of AJ sources looked like me. They weren't they weren't people in the sports industry, or they were people in the periphery of the sports industry. But um he had asked me to like give him some blind items from things that I saw at like a Super Bowl party, and we kicked up a rapport. I wrote a couple of articles for him,
Yeah.
and for the site, and about like just Jets preview stuff and things like that. And we got to talking, and he had this weird thing with the site at the time because, like, obviously sites like that, it's about traffic. It's about driving people's eyes toward advertisers. And he had to really balance like doing sports stories with like pictures of hot girls. It was like, and he really hated the fact that he had to like push around pictures of hot girls. So like as pushback to his superiors, he would push around pictures of athletes behaving badly because like
Mm.
he was like, screw these guys, you know what I mean? So that's kind of what he did, you know? And so we got to talking about the latest athlete that had gotten caught, because now things were a lot more public,
Yeah.
in terms of like athletes doing this type of behavior. And I think I said something to the effect of like, man, that's that's nothing compared to what happened to me at the Jets. And like just told him what I had gone through. And his eyes kind of like lit up, and I was like, oh, I have overshared. And it was off the record, so I knew he couldn't do anything with it, but I was just like, "Oh, I definitely shouldn't have done that," you know? And I got uneasy immediately, seeing how excited he got about it. And, I guess it was a couple months later, I guess he had gone around and done some due diligence trying to, like, suss out who knew what at the Jets and who knew things in the industry, and he thought he had enough to run the story. So that's how
So
that
he
happened.
so he tells you he's going to run the story. I'm sure your stomach sank because you obviously didn't like. Cool, great, glad you're running this. You didn't want any part of
No,
this.
No. And he makes it, I mean, he shows the emails where I say I wanted nothing to do with this. You know what I mean? I was like, there's no way you can talk about what happened to me without disclosing who I am, and you will ruin my life. I was
Right.
like, you will railroad me if you include me in this. And I was like, you just, I can't, dude. Um, and he basically was like, no, still gonna do it.
Yeah. And then if I'm remembering correctly, when the story ran, Deadspin was still in its early stages. This did not, it hit among the blogs, right? And it wasn't until it didn't, put it this way, once he ran with the first story, I don't think it got mainstream media. It wasn't picked up by ESPN and CNN, SI and all and
No.
CBS. It wasn't until I believe a couple months later when he said, oh yeah, update to that Jenn Sterger story from 2 months ago. I've now got voicemails, emails, and the picture. And
Yeah.
that's when it hit. And that's when your life got turned upside down.
He wrote me within hours of posting it. And I just remember going to Central Park that day before I went to the studio and just laying there and being like in this in this middle of Central Park, like on the top of a rock, and just being like, my life is over. Like this is about to get really, really bad. And like you said, no one had taken it seriously when he
Yeah.
first talked about it in August. But the fact that he had the voicemails and all of the proof essentially this time, um, things got really interesting when someone asked Favre at a press conference about it and he froze.
Yeah.
And then the next thing I know, I wake up the next day and all my emails had been hacked again. And it was just a nightmare. You know, I had paparazzi chasing me around the city. It was
Yeah.
stuff that I just wasn't prepared for at all.
And you didn't ask for it. And I think I want to make one thing perfectly
I was
clear
on the
here.
front page of the Post,
Oh
like,
yeah.
it blew up. And what's crazy is, like, the same day that this all happened, I was moving. Moving is already a stressful enough situation.
Yeah.
While trying to move while your life is being blown up in the public eye is also not fun.
Yeah. And I think what a lot of people might not understand, or maybe it wasn't drilled into their head, even if they did watch the doc, is I think people when they talk about that particular, like, wait a second, well, how would AJ DeLario get the voicemails and text messages and a photo unless
He
Jen gave it
paid for
to him,
them. He
or Jen
paid
gave
for
it to
them.
him and he paid you? And you obviously have told me ever since I met you 10 years ago, I somebody basically broke into your, somebody hacked you. That's how. You did not give this up. You were never
Yeah.
paid for this. You did not say,
No.
here you go to add to your story. No, that's not what happened, correct?
No, and to furthermore, like, a lot of my belongings ended up on the internet, not just on Deadspin. Like, I you know, like, I had intimate pictures of me, posted on the internet without my permission that I had no idea how people got them. I had screen grabs from my laptop of me getting ready in my bathroom, unaware that I was being filmed, like Aaron Andrews style, posted
Yeah.
on the internet, you know? So my entire life was invaded during all of this, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and that's not something that I've really talked a lot about because I don't want to encourage people to go out there looking for them because I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get them taken off the internet. It's a constant battle with DCMA type stuff and copyright laws and, you know, essentially fighting revenge porn, you know?
Yeah, that's what it is.
Um, it's it's a very violating experience.
For sure. And, as you said, your life at that point is turned upside down. And I know for you, you were someone who was obviously wanting to get into the media. You wanted to be a host, a
But I was
broadcaster, you
already
as a woman,
I was already
and you were
doing it
doing
at
it.
that point,
But
you know?
then once it happens, you became, I don't know what the word you want to use, toxic to networks and people that wanted to hire you. So talk about what happened to you there once you became, quote unquote, the Favre girl. It turned
Blackballed.
into, yeah, you were
Yeah.
blackballed from the industry. Like, and people
Um,
would legitimately tell you, like, we love your stuff, we think you're great, but we can't hire you.
that was a really hard thing to hear over and over and over again.
Yeah.
I think someone told me the other day, they were like, no one wants a squeaky clean person in the room unless they themselves are squeaky clean. And I think the NFL saw me as a problem. I was a problem to their bottom line. I was a problem to their narrative about all these heroes that they had invested all of this money and effort into creating these like legends around. Um, because even if you aren't a diehard sports fan, you knew who Brett Favre was because of this whole legend, folk hero, cowboy narrative that they had drawn around him, you know?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I was worth nothing to the NFL, you know? Like this man, they're going to continue to make millions and millions of dollars off his likeness far after he was done playing. So the impetus was like to protect him, you know? And I was just a really good scapegoat. I remember when I went and I talked to Roger Goodell, I said something to the effect of, "It doesn't matter what I show you, you still aren't gonna do anything." And he got really angry with me, and he said, "Are you saying I won't do anything? Are you saying I can't do anything?" He's like, "I can do whatever I want." He goes, "I'm the commissioner." And I said, "I'm not saying you can't, I'm saying you
You won't.
won't."
Yeah.
And I was like, "There's a difference."
Yeah.
And I said, "I'm really sorry that I'm not as stupid as you thought I was gonna be."
And I think during that time, that was, I know it was tough for you. And it was, yeah, how could it be tough to, even rewatch it back? I was just like, man, I obviously knowing you personally and having to deal with it and see you talk about it. And I know it's been tough. Was it tough to sign on to the doc knowing, or were you just like, when you were first approached about it, like, hey, we're going to do this, but obviously we'd love you to speak on it? Or were you like, I don't want to relive that, but there's also a part of me that's like, you know what? Now, nationally, for the first time, I get to tell my side. Was it easier to look at it that way, or was it more about, were you really hesitant about jumping into this project?
I mean, look, Rebecca Gillitz was like the 12th person to bring me a project like this. She was just the only person who convinced me that she was gonna tell the story accurately, you
Hmm.
know? Because, so many people came to me and pitched it to me, and they were like, "And don't worry, we'll have a woman director, we'll have a woman producer," and I finally said I finally Rebecca even said that to me the first time we spoke, and I said, "No offense, Rebecca." I said, "No one burned me harder than other women during this scenario."
Yeah.
I said, "So you're gonna have to come at me with something else." And she did. She earned my trust. I say, I liken it to this day as when you pull a dog out of the shelter, you're like, you don't know what that dog's been through. You know what I mean? Like it could bite you. It's unpredictable. But it's all based in trauma and how it was treated before it got to you. And that's kind of my relationship with the media. I have a very deep mistrust of the media because I've seen how easily they are manipulated by people with deeper pockets than me. And it's not about the truth.
Yeah.
The media's coverage of what happened to me in 2010 and how the actual investigation unfolded wasn't about the truth. It was about selling the narrative that the NFL wanted.
Yeah.
And I was just no match for that.
They were going to do anything they could to protect Brett, and they didn't care
Mhm.
what happened to you. You were collateral damage in their story, essentially. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate. And I think that one thing that you just mentioned about, the mistrust and the betrayal, eh, it sucks because I know, that if this story happens now, a lot of people would rally. Not everybody, because you're going to have your internet trolls,
Mhm.
but a lot of people would rally around the woman now if she came out and said this happened to me.
I still think we pick and choose.
Yeah,
I still
I
think
guess it would all depend
people
on who the guy was. If it was
I
somebody
still
that
think
was hated, Antonio Brown, I think they would side with the woman. But if it's somebody like a Brett Favre, an idolized player in that time,
yeah.
and you take somebody now, yeah, they'll
I
pick and
think
choose.
I think it's more of people pick and choose who they wanna believe as victims. I think it's more people, people told me in 2010 I wasn't a good enough victim,
What do you think that meant?
that I was hard to have sympathy for based on how I looked.
That's tough to hear. I
Yeah.
mean,
And you know what it did is it dove into that little voice, you know, it found that crack in my armor of, oh, you're bad, so bad things happen. Well, you look this way, so you must deserve what happened to you. And it just hit that button and that nerve, and it stuck there for the next decade, you know. And I fought really hard for a really long time to undo the stuff that was said to me.
yeah. And I know that, you mentioned, hey, I certainly wasn't the one that was paid to give up my stuff. You also want to make it perfectly clear. You mentioned it in the doc. You've mentioned this on numerous times when you have talked about this subject. Like, there was no flirtation there. You don't even know Brett Favre. You've never spoken to him in your life. You've never
No,
talked to him in your life. You've never met
no,
him in your life.
no.
You worked for the Jets. You were on the field, and I guess you were on the same field as him numerous times, but there was no interaction between you two. And I think people
No.
seem to really, really forget that. I think they think, oh, she must have been flirting with him and he ghosted her, so she turned on him. And that's just, it couldn't be more opposite of what went down.
Yeah.
And that's,
People really came up with their own narrative. And that's the
yeah,
thing. And that's it, and that's the media's job to make sure it's clear what's going on. And I don't know how much of their negligence in reporting the story was just because they didn't have all the facts, and how much of it was we're doing a solid for the NFL, you know?
yeah. And I think for people that watched the doc, there was one woman in there that was very supportive. The other woman they spoke to probably the most was Jamel
Jamel
Hill.
Hill. Mhm.
Jamel Hill, very supportive of you in the doc, and just, but at the time, 2000 and 2010, when this hits, you did not have a lot of support from women in the media, and I know that that was very disheartening for you, because you're just like, you are in the same position as I am, a woman trying to make it in a man's business, a predominantly male business, and immediately you're coming at me like I did something wrong. I mean, we know who they are. People can Google the things that were said by other women journalists who were literally in the same position you were. That had to have been brutal for you. I know
It
it was brutal for you.
Yeah, it sucked because some of these people were my friends.
Yeah.
You know, I considered them friends. They were definitely my peers. And I till this day, I just think there's something about women being programmed to think that there's only enough room at the table for one of us. And that's simply not the case.
Yeah.
But when you believe that lie, you know, some women are willing to do anything to get ahead. It's like they have to be the top. And it's like, why? You know? Why do you have to, if getting to the top means stepping on someone's neck, like, is that what you're willing to do? You know? And that's one thing I can honestly say I'm proud of myself for is I've never done anything in my career that I would look back on and be like, "Oh, I intentionally harmed another person to get ahead." You
Yeah.
know? I've never harmed another person to get ahead, and especially not a woman. And that's something that I can, you know, it helps me sleep at night.
And one of the things, that they kind of did was, you were guilty before you were innocent. You're guilty before proven innocent. Like, you were immediately guilty off the bat for doing nothing other than, I don't know, looking the way you look, because that's what it was.
It's hard to have sympathy for me because I was just a picture to people, you know, and that's something that in the documentary we visited quite a bit, and that was just that people did not treat me like a person.
Yeah.
They didn't treat me like a person. I was just a prop in this entire situation. I was just a piece of, you know, I was just a piece of eye candy there to service a story and to sell magazines and to sell newspapers, you know? Because whenever they would run a story about Favre, they didn't use a picture of him. They used a
Yeah.
picture of me
Yeah.
to sell newspapers and to sell magazines. And the New York Post is the biggest culprit of this. I think the New York Post was incredibly detrimental to my health. I think that they they deliberately rage bait people who they know are not going to read articles, or and they write their articles with such a slant that they deliberately incite violence against the person that they are written about. And that's not journalism, that's bullying.
Yeah. No, it is. And it was happening like at your expense, unfortunately, during that time. I mean, you talk about the way it was handled and the media coming after you. I mean, I know it's one of the worst interviews, and I know you hate revisiting it, but the George Stephanopoulos interview was literally the peak of holy shit. I mean, you talk about somebody that didn't give you any grace whatsoever, immediately
No.
pinned you as guilty. His disdain for you in that interview, just saying like, "Oh, so you didn't really meet him, huh? Never talked to him, really?" Like he didn't believe you. He's sitting there across from you, and you're telling him, "I've never met this man. I've never spoken to this man. I've never texted this man." And George
Wild,
just
isn't
sat
it?
there and just didn't want to believe that that was the case. Like, why would Brett Favre do this to somebody he's never even spoken to or met? Oh, I don't know, because he knows he can. He knows he can get away with this. Like, George, pull your head out of your ass. It's one of the worst
It
interviews I've
was
ever heard.
that one was bad. The Craig Carton and the Boomer Esiason interview was really bad.
I didn't see that until the doc. Like,
Yeah,
and
that
they
one
only showed up.
actually, because it wasn't during it, that interview was actually from like the summer of 2011 when I
Okay.
was promoting my work that I was doing with Major League Baseball and their relationship with Chevy. I was doing like some influencer for hire work for the All-Star game. And um and I remember getting so heated during this interview that when we went to commercial break, I was like, if you guys continue to talk to me like this, I'm going to leave. I said, I don't have to sit here and take this shit. And I was like, and by the way, Boomer, I was like, and I'm not insulting him for young people listening to this. That's his actual
It's
name.
the name, Boomer Esiason. Yeah. Easy, Boomer. Yeah.
Easy, Boomer. And Boomer. But I was like, and Boomer, I was like, the reason this never happened when you played football, because he's an ex-player, I said, is because the technology wasn't available then. I was like, if you wanted to send a girl a picture of yourself, you had to go to Olin Mills and have a portrait session done.
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't know about that interview until they showed it in the doc. And we only got what, 2 sentences? You know, we only showed a clip of it. And even the clip that they showed was bad because you could tell Carton didn't believe you either. It was just
and it's
disgusting.
crazy because like watching the Stephanopoulos interview, I just see a girl that's so scared. I the voice isn't even the same.
That was the thing to me that stuck out in the Stephanopoulos interview. Knowing you and knowing the way you are and the conversations we've had, I was like,
this girl's scared.
You were petrified sitting there. And why wouldn't you? I mean, again, why wouldn't you be? This was ABC News. Like this was a major, you know, Nightline or whatever. I don't know if they ran it at night or in the morning. Either way, it's George Stephanopoulos. Yeah. And it's this our sit down with Jenn Sterger, and you were so petrified in that interview. I can just tell. Anybody that watches it can tell. Like you, but you also said you had no idea what you like. You were hit by a Mack truck at that point. You'd been a media blitz. Like, how do you even handle that? I don't.
And I think, you know, so much of it is like, it was very jarring for me as an individual to see and have it told to me how other people saw me because it didn't match up with who I knew I was.
Yeah.
And, you know, I told you at the beginning of the interview, it was kind of like, you know, when I saw those pictures of the girls in FHM and Maxim, and I was like, I want to be one of those people. And I know if I can be one of those people, it means I would have fooled everybody. And the problem is, I fooled everybody too well into thinking that I was one of those girls, into thinking that that's all I was. When in reality, it's like I was actually a very smart kid. I was a smart kid. I was a nerd. I was socially awkward. And so watching the old footage of me, I cringe because I see it's an act. Do you know what I mean? I see it was a mask that I was wearing to try to fit in and try to belong. Because that's something that I had never experienced, you know, until I got to college and basically got this opportunity and created an alter ego around it. You know, before that, I'm really glad that the documentary shows who I was before I got discovered because that's who I am. That's who my friends know. That's the girl my friends know. is the dork that like just loves pro wrestling and loves, Back to the Future and loves all of the things, like loves all the fandoms, goes to every Comic-Con. Like that's who I am.
The band
Not
geek.
what they wanted me to be. Yeah, not the one they wanted me to be though.
Yeah. I mean, you were in band. Like I did. That was the first time I'd seen those pictures of you in band. It was funny.
Listen, I'm not trying to push that around, Steve. I've got a
Yeah.
reputation to protect, but I was
Yeah.
like, you know what? People need to see this. They need to see who they're picking on. And it's funny because for a while, like in 2012 or 2013, I got this idea to put a picture of 3-year-old me as my profile picture on all my social media because I was like, people will be less tempted to be shitty to a kid. Just a picture of a kid staring at them that they don't know, they will be
Yeah.
less shitty. And it worked a little bit. But there's always going to be those people that just don't care.
Yeah.
I hope that this situation, and I hope the documentary reminds people that I'm human. We're all human. We're all people and we are multifaceted. Like I watched it back the other day and I was like, I honestly felt sorry for Favre because
Why?
I had dissociated the first time I watched it through. The second time I watched it through, it really hammered home the relationship he had with his dad. And I think that that's something that so many people, our age and older can relate to. There wasn't conscious parenting back then. There wasn't, like we weren't thinking that the way we treated kids and the way we raised kids was really going to affect them as adults. That was all like therapy stuff. It was all mumbo jumbo. It was all like you weren't allowed to talk about mental health and you weren't allowed to talk about anything involving male sensitivity and the way you raised men, And I felt sorry for him. When you realize that the guy had that weird relationship with his dad, when you remember that he also went through his own battles with substance abuse and things like that. I don't know, I've just always had this weird ability to extend people grace. And I had never really done that to Brett Favre until the other day. And I was like, what is this? And I was like, oh, Jen, you're actually like, this is part of your healing, because he's the one person in this whole thing that's been really hard to forgive because he's never taken any accountability.
Yeah.
AJ took accountability. AJ is the only person in this entire thing that has ever been like, what I did to her was wrong.
Yeah.
And I think the hardest part for me has been to learn how to forgive people that don't necessarily deserve your forgiveness, but you forgive them for the sake of yourself moving forward versus relieving them of something. Because if you think that you're relieving them of something, girl, they weren't thinking about you to begin with. I don't think that what he's done, like what they've done to me has kept them up a night. Truly, I don't think that it's mattered to them at all,
Yeah.
And so I just have had to focus on my own healing, but I did find it interesting, like I said the other day, that I was just like, "Oh, we've reached a new chapter." And that's kind of how this whole thing has felt for a long time, is, my view on it changes depending on where I am in my process of grieving what my life could have been and celebrating the life that I've built instead.
You mentioned AJ, the one who broke the story and betrayed your trust. He did come out. I can't remember what year it was. Maybe it was 2018. He wrote a op-ed piece. Also, I think personally, didn't he do an interview with you or sat down with you? Did you guys meet in person where he personally apologized and then wrote a piece about how I apologized to Jenn Sterger, or how was it done
So
again?
so it was about a dog. Because remember, I was running a nonprofit animal rescue in Los Angeles,
Yes,
and I
that's
had
right.
these puppies that I had found in the desert, and one of them looked like his childhood dog. And Kat Dennings from Two Broke Girls shared these puppies on her Instagram story. AJ's fiance saw the story, and reached out to my rescue. I was the one that responded because I was the lead on those animals.
Mm-hmm.
And when they saw my email come back through, there apparently there was a loud gasp that was let out. And a few minutes later, I got an email from AJ, and it said, "Hey, didn't want you to show up at my house and be faced with a ghost from your past. And totally understand if you don't want us to adopt this dog. But if I don't get the chance to see you and say this to you in person, I'm incredibly sorry for what I did to you."
Hmm.
And I said, "You and my personal relationship has nothing to do with whether or not you'll be a good home for this animal. So I'm happy to drop the dog off." And so I could have had somebody else in my rescue do that, but I don't know. There was just a part of me that was like, I want him to see that I'm a real person. And so I showed up there just covered in dust from having picked up these puppies in the desert, and watched the dog play with his baby and sat there and talked to his fiance. And AJ didn't really say anything. He just kind of hung out in the background, and he wrote me later and said, I'm sorry I didn't say much. He goes, "I think I was just so stunned that you were in my living room.
Hmm.
And I've always had all these things that I thought I wanted to say to you, and none of them could come up because I just froze." But he's like, "But if you're interested," he's like, "I would like to sit down with you and talk with you about this." So I asked my lawyer if I should do it, and he said no. So I did it anyway. and and honestly, it felt it was a very validating experience sitting down with AJ and having the conversation that we did, because he obviously had changed a lot in the 10 years since the incident, or the 8 years, I guess, because we met, I think, in 2018. Um, he had changed quite a bit. He had gotten sober. He'd left media. He had been sued by Hulk Hogan, and he and Gawker had been sued by Hulk Hogan, um,
Yeah.
for the tape, you know.
Yeah.
Which honestly reminds me how small the world is, because in 2008, when I was going through all my stuff with Favre, the guy that I had moved to New York for, I caught cheating on me with Brooke Hogan. And I
Wow.
was just like, this is just too small of a world, you
Yeah.
know? And it was just, AJ gave me a lot of clarity in terms of like things that had happened during that time period that I wasn't aware of, you know. And he told me, he's like, "Jen, I did my due diligence on this." He's like, "I honestly thought like I was reporting a worthy news story." And I go, "You were, you just burned somebody in doing it."
Yeah.
You know, I said, "You weren't, as much as I wasn't the right martyr for the cause, AJ wasn't the right delivery method for the message."
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I think that that's such an important part of handling sensitive dynamics like this, is making sure that they are handled with the care and the dignity that they deserve.
So that I assume that conversation was a pretty major part of your healing process, to hear
For
that from
sure.
AJ and for him to write that article and say, I basically paraphrase the article, "I was dead wrong. I never should have written that. Never should have betrayed Jen's trust."
I never
So,
should have betrayed Jen's trust. And he goes, "But I think the part that makes me tear up every time is," he said, "but I never saw her as a person."
yeah.
And I think that that's something that society has been guilty of as well, is I never saw her as a person. And the accountability that I've taken for that is, I didn't give them a person to meet. You know, I gave them the idea of what I thought they wanted to me, which was this hot girl, you know, with little substance. Like I played the game, you know, and that is me owning my part of that. And now I think I've done a really good job in reclaiming and honestly showing people who I really am. And that's the person that all my friends know, you know, like that was like, when any of my friends would talk about the Favre thing, they're like, "People don't know you, you know, people don't know you like we know you." And like I said, looking back on it now, I realized that I was kind of wearing this, like, for lack of a better word, a wrestling gimmick, you know?
Yeah.
And at times that gimmick protected me because it was kayfabe, and I'm like, that's not me. They don't know me. But when it got so deeply personal, and people were making judgments about my character, I was like, oh, this is bad. Like this is it. It's almost like I got lost in the sauce of it all because the internet told me who I was and they got it wrong.
Did you start to believe what the internet was telling you who you were?
I started to believe that I was bad. But
Mm.
the internet can't make you believe something that you already don't believe yourself.
I know you said you've been through years, obviously you've been in therapy, you've been doing it for a while. Obviously this was traumatic enough. What's some of the biggest things that you've taken from therapy out of this, and where have you gotten to at a point where, you said the other day, like for the first time, you could look at Brett and be like, I feel sorry for that guy for what he went through. Doesn't excuse what he did. So are you saying basically like, hey, I'm not excusing what Brett did, but I kind of actually have an understanding about more about his upbringing and why he did what he did? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, I think I've spent a lot more time around addiction and people with substance abuse problems, and I have a lot better understanding in terms of the things that they've been through, the ones that make it out and the ones that actually do something with their lives and, become sober, and the ones who don't and continue to live in denial that there's an issue. Do you know what I mean? And those are just two different types of people, the ones that are willing to confront the problem and the ones that aren't, I think my divorce was a big part of that, in terms of me learning how I sacrifice myself and how I allow people to treat me just because I understand why they do the things that they do. And I think the big part of my healing has been discovering that just because I understand why someone is the way they are doesn't give them the right to harm me. And that's been a really big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, I think the last time I had you on the podcast was, well, it definitely was when you were married, but we
Mhm.
had you and your ex on. Remember we played like the newlywed game where we were asking each other questions and when you can answer questions about the other one. Like that was the last time I had you on. I remember that
Yeah.
specifically. And,
And I think I've been through a lot of changes, and I think the last couple of
yeah,
years, I think listen, we've all been through a lot of changes. I think we have really shrugged off the fact that we collectively went through something very traumatic with each other in 2020.
yeah,
With the pandemic. A lot of people lost a lot of things. They lost jobs, they lost people. They lost like our lives were completely changed, and I think the pandemic slowed down life enough that and everything got quiet enough that I was forced to really take a look at negative patterns that I was, circling around, whether that was putting myself in situations where I was able to be taken advantage of, seeing red flags and blowing through them because it looked like a carnival, like whether it was professional, whether it was personal, in friendships and in relationships, in all of it. And just realizing that I deserved better.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I know you have been through a lot. Something that you posted the other day, and when you posted it, I took a screenshot of it because you had no problem talking about it. And that was because this doc is coming out. I knew that there was going to be somebody out there. This person's probably a Packer fan, probably lives in the Milwaukee area, whatever. Probably has a green 4 jersey or a white 4 jersey. But you know what screenshot I'm talking about, right?
Mhm.
The troll that. Can I read it to you? Because I want other people to hear
Sure.
it because they might have seen it.
Sure.
This person said, I cannot believe you're bringing this crap up again years later as if you didn't get enough notoriety the first time. I will always be on his side. You know exactly what you were doing. And when you didn't see a payday or it go your way, you threw a fit and you threw him under the bus, and you know exactly the kind of female you are. I mean, it's almost comical. This person clearly doesn't know you and is
Doesn't know
clearly
me, doesn't know the facts,
doesn't know any of
more
the facts.
importantly.
It's clearly just have to be from Wisconsin or a huge Packer fan, because nobody that isn't a Favre fan or a Packer fan would have that type of take about a documentary they haven't even seen yet.
Nope.
You know, it's just
100%.
ridiculous. Yeah. So, and you responded, and you were kind in your response, but killed them with kindness in your response. I'm not going to read it, but if you want to just like paraphrase what you said. But when you get something like that, because there will probably be other people that now that the doc is out will say, oh, why is she bringing this up? It's like, well, you didn't create the doc yourself. Someone else did and asked you to be a part of it. There's nothing wrong with it.
I can tell when someone's writing something from a wounded place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I can tell when I'm interacting with somebody that's coming at me from a place of being triggered. And she wrote that to me and then subsequently got mad at me for posting it on my stories, because she's like, you knew what you were doing when you posted this in your stories. And I was like, may I remind you that you came to a perfect stranger's page to come and spout about things you do not know and make assumptions about my character and make assumptions about my motives with no facts whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I was like, why did you do that? And I think the thing we can always do with people that come at us with those type of things is I always get curious, because they can't stand it. Because I make them look internally when I ask them questions. I was like, what made you do that? And she's like, I could have worked in sports, but I chose to stop working in sports and to go be a nurse so that I could serve people. And I went,
thank you.
Bingo. No, but that's the case. It's
Yeah.
often when people get mad, it's because they're seeing something that they themselves wanted. And not saying she wanted bad treatment, but honestly, when women say things like this, I'm like, you wanted that attention? It
Yeah.
sounds like you would have, you know? And it's whether they wanted to work in the industry and the industry didn't give them the chance that they wanted. And look, that's something that I own. I own that. When people are like, she should have never been working in sports, I'm like, you're right. I had no business working in sports. I simply loved sports. I got an opportunity and I ran with it.
Yeah.
But when people ask me now, like, what did you like most about working in sports? I go, that's like asking me what I liked most about my most abusive relationship, Like,
Yeah.
I'm not, what do you want me to do? Romanticize it?
Yeah.
I think the only thing I really liked about working in sports was the stories. It was telling those stories about like underdog. I loved an underdog story. I loved a story where someone had to overcome something huge in their life to get to where they were in this moment. That's the thing that I related to in sports, and that's the thing that I loved covering. And I loved seeing big upsets. I root against Goliath every single time. You know what I mean? It's honestly my favorite thing to do when I watch sports. Is I'm like, I'm taking the underdog always.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't always pan out, but when it does, there's no better feeling. And it's one of my favorite things I loved about covering sports. I liked covering the people. I liked covering the human interest stories. And I think that that's honestly what I saw in this documentary with Favre. Is I was like, oh, these are the pieces that I was missing to understand this individual and why they did this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And as much as people got furious at the way the trailer was cut, I think when they watch it, they'll realize it's not a hit piece. It's a piece that examines a person for all the facets of who they are. And some of it might make you angry.
Yeah.
But the other thing that people always ask me is, well, what would you do different? And I don't think that's a fair question to ask, because if I do anything differently, do I end up where I am now? And I'm happy where I am now. I've been through some terrible things, and I've been through some really hard things, but I have done so much work on myself, and I know myself so much better that it's allowing me to show up on stage and be the most authentic me I've ever been. And sometimes it's scary, um, being that vulnerable. But you know, it's it's my density. That's what I look at when I watch that movie. I'm like, if
Yeah.
I change any of these things, if I don't get discovered by Brent Musburger, if I don't do Maximum Playboy, if I don't work for the Jets, if I don't work for the Jets, then this doesn't happen. And I'm still working in sports and I'm still being held under a glass ceiling that I'm never going to punch through because no one has. Let's face it. Any woman that's ever punched through a glass ceiling, it's because they were lifting her up in that moment just that the industry could pull her back down and say she wasn't good enough. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
comedy is where I was supposed to be this whole time. Because anyone that knows me knows I'm wildly irreverent, and I I mean, it saved my life, you know?
Yeah. And when you were out here a few months ago, you did the Addison Improv opening for Anna Akana, and great show. It's the first time it's the first time I'd ever seen your stand up, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Both of you. You got to open for Anna, who's an amazing woman. A lot that she's been through.
She's
You guys
she's
have.
been huge. She's been a huge part of my journey, in terms of, she's she'll be the first person to say she's a client of mine, and I helped her write, and I helped her get back on stage after the stalking incident took her off stage,
Yeah.
because I think we both knew what it was like to come back from something that almost took us out of what we loved.
Yeah.
And we've bonded over that. She's such a force on stage, and as a human being, we just get each other. Like, we travel like two little old ladies. We're not we don't go out, we don't drink. We're both completely sober.
Yeah.
And she's just truly, I'm privileged to call her a client, but I'm even more privileged to call her a good friend.
Yeah. And you said when you were talking about what you like to cover in sports, the underdog story, and it's almost like that's what you have become, because you're a person yourself that has a story of overcoming adversity. You've pivoted your career from sports now to comedy. You're rebuilding your brand. You're getting your name back, and it is an underdog story for you, and to make this comeback. And like you said, you are doing comedy, but kind of update people on what you have been up to the last few years. Not just stand up, you teach classes
Yeah.
in the stand up world. So just let everybody know, along with your dog rescue work, which I love.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work, helping other women tell their stories. I teach people how to tell their stories. I teach people, jokes, mostly women and LGBTQ. We have a small community here. I partnered with the woman that runs this amazing community called Witty Titties, and I'm one of her instructors for her classes where we run like lower income workshops, because comedy classes and acting classes and all of that is just so expensive. And we wanted to make something that was easily accessible to women so that price and money was not the thing that kept them from pursuing their dreams. And I like teaching women how to make this a career, because I've successfully made this a career out of nothing.
Yeah.
Um, I've done really like the last, God, definitely like the last 10 years with relatively no representation. Um, I dropped my manager after the Favre stuff happened just because they really wanted me to write a book, and we had creative differences in terms of what I wanted my career to look like. And I didn't have any interest in writing a book at the time because I honestly, and it wouldn't have been a good book. It would have just been trauma dumping and a bunch of facts and boring. And that's not that's not the part that was interesting.
Yeah.
The part of the story that was interesting was all of the things that I did to keep myself sane behind the scenes. It was, living among the Mennonites in Lancaster, PA, to disappear and get away from New York publicity. Like those are the stories that people go, you did what? You know, like surrounded by horse and buggy. Like it's literally it's Schitt's Creek. You know what I mean? Like that's what I basically went and lived. You know, I I want to tell this story finally, like once and for all, on the biggest platform that there is right now, because I think there's so many people out there that don't have this opportunity, that are currently in these situations. And I think that's why it's important we tell these stories, to help people who are going through something similar, that just need to see that getting out of it's possible. Because when you're in it, it feels like you're drowning, and it feels like there's no way out, and it feels like there's no way that things can get better. And I want people to look at me and say, but it can.
Have you have a podcast right now with a fellow comedian and a friend of yours, Eddie Pence, called Not Today. Have you thought about doing a podcast where you talk about stuff like this? Not what happened to you, but overcoming adversity, dealing with trauma. Have you thought about doing a podcast along those lines, talking to other women who have been through similar situations and have been torn down by the media? Have you ever thought about doing a podcast like that?
I have, but I think that my podcast inadvertently does all of that. And I also think that making it just about women that have been through stuff completely denies the fact that men are victims too.
Yeah.
Men are just as men are just as capable of having this happen to them as well. And the issue with that is usually that men won't be believed if they come forward, or they think they won't be believed, so they just never report it. There's something along the lines of like 1 in 4 women were sexually abused or assaulted by the time they were an adolescent, and it's 1 in 6 men. And I think the problem that happened with Me Too is that Me Too really made it about men versus women, you know? And it never should have been that. It should have been victims and survivors versus the dynamics and the power imbalances that allow these things to take place. The people who are doing these things to people and preying on individuals who are in a deficit of power. Like that's what I think it should have been about. The minute it became genderized is when you have all of these, for like rogue men podcasts where all these men are like, yeah, we're left behind. Yeah, we're always accused of being the bad guy and not all men. And it's like, no, we lost the plot, and I think it should just be more about examining where we are letting people down and allowing people to be taken advantage of and preyed upon because of you know inequalities in power dynamics, whether it be in the workplace or wherever.
Yeah. No, it's happening a lot more than people think. And, just like you,
But
just
yeah,
you didn't want to run with it when it was happening to you. There are people probably going through the same thing right now that they just don't want to say anything.
What's crazy though, Steve, is I had a publicist the other day try to have ChatGPT write me a bio. And it showed me just how bad the narrative is out there and how wrong the narrative is out there and how dangerous that has been to my career. And the media is to blame for it.
Yeah.
And that's why we're doing this. It's to rewrite this, hopefully once and for all.
Yeah. Like you said, it's not a hit piece. Hopefully people that are listening to this today have in the last 48 hours watched the documentary, but it is not a hit piece. These are factual things that happen. This isn't they didn't have to dig deep to find stuff.
No.
This is all public
and
knowledge
ladies,
stuff.
Listen, your husband will watch this with you. Your man will watch this with you because it's about football. And you get to watch it because, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a woman who hasn't been through something like this or hasn't felt like other women have betrayed her. Like you cover reality television shows, for Christ's sake. Like it's so funny. I actually had a reality television producer tell me one time, they're like, Jen, don't ever do reality television because he's like, you would be a terrible pirate. He's like, you don't play games. You don't understand female rules. he's like, it's just bad. And he's just, and he goes, and it's adorable watching you like try to figure it out and like understand like what's happening, but like don't do it. You know, he's like, I see you racking your brain about why women do this and why, and it's like, Jen, people don't operate the way you do, you know? And I think that's been a really illuminating part of this. So you're not going to see me on The Bachelor is what I'm trying to say.
No, you're not going to make it on there. That's too bad.
No.
What about back in the day? Was it ever?
They asked me.
Did they? I was going to say.
Yeah, they asked me.
Want you to go on as a contestant?
Yes, in 2011, they did it. And then the other show I got approached about doing, but I was going to be the main focus of, like I would have been the Bachelorette type character on it, was a show that they were going to do for E, and it was like about having your gay best friend be one of the guys in the house and like be like a mole. Exactly. And he'd be the mole in the situation. And we would like have little like gay, you know, like situations where like a situation room where like they'd come in and like give me all the downloads of stuff that was happening, you know. But I ended up meeting somebody, and I felt bad participating in it because it wouldn't have been ethical. It wouldn't have been real, which I know is silly because so often like with these reality shows, you find out that the person had like a boyfriend or whatever on the side the whole time anyway. And it's just like, I can't do this, Steve. Like I'm not wired for this. I'm too honest.
Did that show end up existing just with a different lead?
Because the other thing was they decided that it was a premise that couldn't be repeated. And everybody's like, we need to have something that we can like bang out multiple seasons of, you know?
Yeah, because if somebody saw the first season, they'd be like, wait a second. One of us is probably a gay friend of hers. And
it's probably the guy wearing the boa. I think it's, you know, like that was the other thing, is I was like, my gay is not fooling anyone. It's not. Like he comes with full sequins and an Elton John poster. He's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, because they'd have to portray him as somebody.
Have to grow it up. And he's like, I can do it. And I was like, Gavin, absolutely not.
No, you can't. Well, the documentary is called Untold: The Fall of Favre. It came out 2 days ago on Netflix. You can check it out. Jenn, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this again. Thank you for being such a good friend. I'm so happy to see your success in the last couple of years, being able to see a couple shows. I forgot about the Huntington Beach show that I saw as well.
You've seen it's Tale of Two Worlds, truly. Yeah. But I honestly think the one at the Huntington Beach one was more fun because it was just me shouting at people. And just because I was just a rowdy crowd. Like those shows are the ones that test you, you know. But I'm really looking forward to coming back to the Dallas area when I am ready to do my hour. Because I am starting to talk about this on stage, because I think the documentary, and truly I think finding this sympathy for Favre is unlocking something new in the story for me that I think was keeping me from writing about it in my hour. And now, having done the work around it with my therapist and things like that, I think I'm ready to tell it in a way that even non-sports fans can relate to, you know? So
yeah, I'm excited.
I'm excited to do the hour.
That's great. Yeah, and obviously let me know anytime you're out here in Dallas and do your show. Again, Jenn, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Obviously, we will certainly be in touch for sure.
It's great seeing you, Steve.
You too. Bye.
Bye, buddy.